Okay, so like imagine you're back in high school biology class, but this time it's way more chill. No tests, no pop quizzes, just straight up fascinating plant stuff. Today we're going deep on how plants get all the good stuff they need to actually live and thrive.
Right. It's like their own secret highway system for transporting water and nutrients.
Exactly. It's basically their version of a circulatory system. We're going to be diving into the xylem and phloem.
Yeah, the xylem and phloem, super important.
Definitely. Okay, but first, like, why do plants even need a whole transport system?
Yeah.
Can't they just, like, soak stuff up directly?
Well, think about it. A massive tree, like a giant redwood, can be hundreds of feet tall. If it relied only on simple diffusion to move water and nutrients all the way up to the top.
Yeah, that would take forever.
Exactly. It just wouldn't be efficient enough to keep up with a plant that big.
Makes sense. So that's when the xylem comes in, right?
That's right. Xylem is like the plant's water highway. Think of it as long, hollow tubes running from the roots all the way up to the leaves.
Okay, those tubes got to be pretty strong to carry water that high.
Oh, they are. It's wild xylem vessels are actually made of dead cells.
Dead cells. Wait, what?
Yeah. But before they died, they developed these super thick walls that are reinforced with this substance called lignin.
Lignin.
Yeah, it's the stuff that gives wood its strength. So these cells, they basically sacrifice themselves to become the plant's plumbing system and support structure all in one.
Wow, talk about dedication, right?
Right. And this lignin reinforcement, it's super important because it keeps those xylem vessels from collapsing under pressure. It's also a big part of what helps the plant stand upright and reach for the sunlight.
Okay, so it's like multitasking at its finest.
Exactly.
I bet the xylem is arranged differently depending on where it is in the plant, right? Like in the roots versus the stem versus the leaves.
You're absolutely right. It's all about providing the right kind of support in each part of the plant. So in the roots,
Yeah, what about the roots?
xylem forms this central core, kind of like a strong anchor, which helps it push through the soil.
Okay, makes sense. And in the stem?
The xylem is more towards the outside of the stem. Think of it like scaffolding. It provides support against bending.
Oh, smart. And what about in the leaves?
Well, in leaves, xylem forms a network of veins. It's what supports those thin, delicate leaf structures.
Okay, that makes sense. So xylem is all about water transport and support, right? But what about that other key player we mentioned?
You mean the phloem?
Yeah, the phloem. What's its deal?
Phloem is like the plant's sugar superhighway. Think of it as the system that transports all those yummy sugars that plants make during photosynthesis.
Oh, right, like sucrose and all that. So it's like a delivery system for the plant's food.
Exactly. And unlike xylem, which is made of dead cells, phloem is made of living cells. It relies on two main types, sieve tube elements and companion cells. Sieve tube elements are the actual pipes that transport the sugary sap.
Okay. And what about companion cells? What do they do?
Think of them as the support crew for the sieve tube elements. They provide energy and help carry out the living functions that sieve tube elements can't do on their own.
Oh, I see. Because the sieve tube elements don't actually have, like, a nucleus or anything.
Right. So the companion cells are essential for keeping them alive and functioning.
So like a little teamwork situation going on there.
Absolutely. A crucial partnership.
Cool. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how water actually moves up through the plant. Doesn't it kind of seem like it's defying gravity?
Right.
So like, how does water climb all the way to the top of a huge tree?
Well, it's all about this concept called water potential. Water always wants to move from an area of high water potential to an area of low water potential.
Okay, so it's like water flowing downhill.
Exactly. But the journey of water through a plant's root system is a bit more intricate than just a simple downhill slide. It can actually take two different pathways, the epiplast pathway and the simplest pathway.
Two pathways. Why is that?
Well, it comes down to efficiency and control. The epiplast pathway is kind of like the express route. Water moves quickly through the spaces between cells and along the cell walls, but there's not much regulation there.
Okay, got it. So what about the simplest pathway?
The simplest pathway, that's more like the scenic route. Water moves through the living cytoplasm of cells, connected by these tiny channels called plasmodesmata. It's slower, but it gives the plant more control over which substances are moving through.
So it's like one pathway is fast but risky, and the other is slower but safer, and plants can use both.
Exactly. Plants are smart. They use both pathways to make sure they get the water they need quickly while also filtering out anything harmful. And get this, there's this cool structure in the root called the Casparian strip.
The Casparian strip.
Yeah, it's like a checkpoint that forces water from the apoplast pathway, that fast lane, into the slower, more regulated, simplest pathway.
So it's like a security checkpoint, making sure only the good stuff gets through to the rest of the plant.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about the water potential gradient, but there's even more to the story of how water moves upward. It actually involves a combination of forces: transpiration, cohesion, and adhesion.
Okay, let's break that down. First up, transpiration. What is that exactly?
Transpiration is basically the evaporation of water from the leaves. You could almost think of it like the plant is sweating, but this sweating plays a vital role in pulling water up from the roots.
Wait, how does sweating pull water up?
Well, as water evaporates from those tiny openings on the leaves, called stomata, it creates this sort of suction
A
force.
suction force.
Yeah, like pulling on a straw. This suction pulls more water upwards through the xylem, and that's where cohesion comes in.
Cohesion. Okay, I remember that word.
Water molecules are amazing. They have this incredible ability to skip together.
Oh, right, because of hydrogen bonds, right.
Exactly. So as one water molecule is pulled upwards, it brings its buddies along with it. It creates this continuous chain of water molecules moving up the plant.
That's amazing. So it's like a chain reaction, each water molecule pulling the next one up. Okay, and what about adhesion? Where does that fit in?
Adhesion is like the backup support system. Water molecules are also attracted to the walls of the xylem vessel, so they kind of cling to the sides, which helps them move upwards more easily.
Got it. So it's all about teamwork. Transpiration pulls, cohesion keeps the water molecules connected, and adhesion gives them extra support.
Exactly. A perfectly orchestrated system.
So we've been talking about how transpiration pulls all that water up from the roots. But isn't losing water through transpiration like a bad thing for the plant? Especially in dry places.
That's a great question. It's true, transpiration does come with the risk of water loss, but we also have to remember that transpiration is kind of a side effect of the plant needing to exchange gases for photosynthesis.
Oh, right. Plants need to take in carbon dioxide to make their food, right? And that means opening up those little pores on their leaves.
Exactly, the stomata. And when the stomata open to let carbon dioxide in, some water vapor inevitably escapes. It's all about the difference in water concentration.
So it's like this trade-off. Plants need to open their stomata to make food, but they risk losing water in the process.
Exactly. And the environment plays a big role here. Things like light, temperature, humidity, and wind can all impact how quickly that transpiration happens.
Okay, let's break those down. How does light intensity affect water loss?
Well, think about it. Plants need sunlight to do photosynthesis, right? And to capture that sunlight, they need to open their stomata. So as the light gets stronger, the stomata open wider.
Okay, that makes sense. But doesn't that mean they lose more water?
Yep, more light, more photosynthesis, but also more transpiration. It's a balancing act for the plant.
Got it. So what about temperature? How does that impact transpiration?
As the temperature rises, water molecules have more energy, so they evaporate more quickly from the leaf surface, which leads to faster transpiration.
Okay, so on a hot day, a plant would sweat more, just like we do. What about humidity? How does that factor in?
Humidity is all about how much moisture is already in the air. If the air is humid, it means it's already got a lot of water vapor in it, so there's less of a difference between the inside of the leaf and the outside air.
So that would slow down transpiration.
Exactly. But in a dry environment, like a desert, the humidity is low, so the water evaporates from the leaves much more quickly.
And what about wind? I can imagine wind drying things out pretty fast.
You're right. Wind blows away that humid air that kind of hangs out around the stomata, which keeps the transpiration rate high.
So strong sunlight, high temperature, low humidity, and wind all make transpiration happen faster.
You got it. That's why understanding these factors is so important, especially if you're growing plants.
Right. Okay, but what about those desert plants we talked about before? The xerophytes. They survive in those super dry conditions. How do they do it?
Xerophytes. They're masters of water conservation. They've evolved all sorts of clever ways to survive in those harsh, dry environments. One trick they have is something called sunken stomata.
Sunken stomata. What's that?
Basically, their stomata are kind of tucked away in these little pits on the leaf surface. It protects them from the drying effects of the wind.
Oh, that's smart. Like a little hideaway for the stomata.
Right. And some xerophytes even have tiny hairs on their leaves, which can trap moist air around the stomata.
Another way to reduce water loss.
Exactly. They might also have a really thick, waxy cuticle on their leaves, which acts like a waterproof barrier.
And what about those cacti with spines instead of leaves? Is that another adaptation?
You bet. Having spines instead of leaves reduces the surface area so they lose less water through transpiration. Plus, it helps protect them from animals that might want to eat them.
So plants are pretty resourceful. They've evolved all these ways to deal with these extreme conditions. But speaking of transport, how do they move those sugars they make during photosynthesis?
Ah, that's where our friend the phloem comes back into play. It's all about translocation, the movement of those sugars, mainly sucrose, to other parts of the plant.
Okay, so it's like a delivery system.
Exactly. It carries the sugars from where they're made, the source, to where they're needed or stored, the sink.
So the leaves are the main source, right? Because that's where photosynthesis happens.
Right. And the sinks would be things like growing fruits, roots, developing flowers, anywhere the plant needs energy or is storing food.
Got it. And this whole process, how does it actually work? Is it similar to the water potential gradient we talked about earlier?
Well, that's where the leading theory comes in, which is called the mass flow hypothesis.
Hmm.
It suggests that sugar transport in the phloem works kind of like a pressure flow system.
A pressure flow system. Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine this at the source. In the leaves, sugars are actively loaded into the phloem sieve tubes. This draws water into the phloem by osmosis, which increases the pressure inside.
Okay, so like a high pressure zone near the source.
Exactly. This high pressure pushes the sugary sac down towards the sink. And at the sink, the sugars are unloaded and used or stored.
So the pressure drops at the sink end.
Right. And this pressure difference between the source and the sink keeps the sugars moving in the right direction.
Okay, that makes sense. So this mass flow hypothesis, is there any evidence to support it?
There's actually a lot of evidence. For example, scientists have used aphids. You know those tiny bugs that feed on plant sap?
Yeah, those old guys.
While researchers have used them to study the pressure inside the phloem, they found that the sap flows out a lot faster near the leaves where the sugars are being loaded.
Wow, so even aphids can help us understand how plants work.
Nature's pretty amazing. And there's another piece of evidence that comes from something called bark ringing.
Bark ringing.
Yeah, basically, you remove a ring of bark from a tree. This interrupts the phloem, but not the xylem. And when you do this, you see this buildup of sugars above the ring.
Oh, wow, so that shows the sugars were flowing downwards.
Right. Multiple lines of evidence point to this pressure flow system in the phloem.
But are there any challenges to this theory? Does it explain everything about how sugars move in plants?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that science is all about constantly asking questions and refining our understanding. So while the mass flow hypothesis is the leading explanation, there are definitely some things that researchers are still looking into. For instance, some scientists point out that those sieve plates we talked about earlier, the ones with those tiny holes, they could make it difficult for the sugary sap to flow easily.
So maybe there's more to the story.
Maybe. But even with those ongoing questions, the mass flow hypothesis is still a pretty solid explanation for how sugars move through the phloem.
This is all so fascinating. It's incredible how complex these seemingly simple transport systems actually are.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to discover about the world of plants.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on xylem and phloem, these amazing plant highways for moving water and sugars around. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Definitely. But there's another layer of complexity we haven't touched on yet, and that's plant hormones.
Hormones, okay, yeah, I remember those from biology class. But remind me, what exactly are plant hormones?
Think of hormones as the plant's communication system. They're like chemical messengers that travel throughout the plant and regulate all kinds of processes. Everything from growth and development to how plants respond to changes in their environment.
So how do these hormones fit in with the transport systems? Do they, like, interact with the xylem and phloem?
Absolutely. Hormones actually play a really important role in coordinating both water and sugar transport. Let's take abscisic acid as an example. It's also known as ABA.
ABA, okay.
So this hormone is produced in the roots when the plant is experiencing water stress, like, say, during a drought.
So when a plant is thirsty, it sends out a signal.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. The ABA travels up through the xylem all the way to the leaves, where it causes the stomata to close.
Oh, right. Closing the stomata would help the plant conserve water.
Exactly. It's like a water conservation signal. ABA helps the plant cope with those dry conditions. Now, another hormone that's involved in water transport is auxin.
Auxin. That's the one that makes plants bend towards light, right?
That's the one. But auxin also has a role in root development. It stimulates the growth of those tiny root hairs.
Which increases the surface area for water absorption.
Right. So auxin indirectly helps the plant take up more water.
Wow. One hormone, multiple jobs. So what about sugar transport? Do hormones affect that too?
They do. There's a hormone called cytokinin, which is all about promoting growth and developing tissues like young leaves, fruits, and seeds.
In those growing tissues, they need a lot of sugar, right?
Exactly. They act as sinks, drawing in those sugars from the phloem. So cytokinin basically tells the plant, hey, send more sugars over here. We're growing.
It's like the plant has its own internal communication network for managing all these processes.
It really does. This whole system of hormones and transport networks is incredibly complex.
It's like a perfectly choreographed dance. But speaking of challenges, we've talked a lot about environmental stresses and things like climate change and pollution. How do those affect the plant's ability to transport water and sugars?
Well, scientists are finding that these environmental stressors can actually mess with those finely tuned systems in a lot of ways. Air pollution, especially ozone, can damage leaf tissues, which can affect both water and gas exchange.
So it's like pollution is throwing a wrench into the works.
Yeah, pretty much. And then as temperatures rise because of climate change, plants need to transpire more to stay cool. But that can lead to water stress, especially in places that are already dry.
Right. It's like a vicious cycle.
It is. And this increased need for water can really strain the xylem's ability to keep up.
So all these things are interconnected.
Yeah.
Changes in the environment can really impact these basic processes that plants need to survive.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to understand these plant processes. We need to know how they work and what threatens them if we want to protect them.
This has been such an incredible journey through the world of plants. I'm honestly in awe of how complex and resilient they are.
Me too. Plants are truly remarkable.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and passion with us. I think we all learned a ton today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it fascinating and maybe even inspiring. Keep those curiosity roots growing.